Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your day off on Wednesday. So, the next couple weeks will be devoted to studying the Maya, which is a civilization in the Americas. So, studying Mayan civilization is both difficult and exciting. It's particularly difficult because of the location. So, the Maya were in parts of Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, Honduras, and El Salvador, which is largely rainforest. And rainforest is not a great place for archaeological artifacts to survive for centuries and centuries. Um, Also, by the time Europeans got here uh, in the late 14th century, right, 1492 and on, the Mayan civilization had already been gone for over 500 years. So, uh, by the time at least Western historians encountered uh, any evidence of Mayan civilization, it had already been uh, composing in the rainforest for about 500 years. But this also makes it rather exciting. Right now, important and exciting discoveries are being made, and there's still a lot of open questions to be answered. So, if any of you are, budding historians or think you might go on into graduate school, this is an area that's really open for study, and there's opportunity to make really interesting discoveries. So, thing that's unique about the Maya, if you look at other ancient civilizations, be they the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, um, they developed around rivers, right? And they irrigated the dry land by using canals. And this sort of irrigation system, the populations tended to center around the rivers or around the canals that came off the rivers. And at a certain point, you need water management, right? There's going to be disputes over water, and government, right, develops arguably around managing that water. That's sort of the beginning of nation, right? um, the Maya developed in a rainforest, so they used a very different type of agriculture called slash and burn. So what happens is you clear the land first and let all that vegetation sort of dry out, and then you burn it, and that will leave a nice layer of ash, which is nice fertilizer for the land, and it's a good way to clear land for crops, except that you only get a few years out of that land, and then you have to move on and slash and burn another area. If you wait long enough, the area that you slash and burn will regrow and you can do it again. But it eats up land fairly quickly, and it's hard to sustain a large population on that kind of agriculture. So some historians have argued that the Mayan Empire was really very small. But the thing is, if you look at the ruins, right, it looks like very large cities, right? Huge buildings, huge temples, quite a few of them, right? There are quite a few, something like 80 Mayan cities at their peak. Um, so it seems like it was a rather large civilization. People have argued, well, those big cities were mostly empty. They were just religious centers. Um, the most recent scholarship suggests that, yeah, like in big cities like Tikal, like tens of thousands of people were living there. Right? It was a big city and they did manage to feed all these people. um, that may have been, that may have been due to other forms of agriculture that it looks like we know they also practiced terraced agricultures along hillsides, and they did create canals. So they may had not have been restricted to just slash and burn. So much of what we know about the Maya is from these texts that remain carved on these stone monuments, which we call stelae. Um, the stone does rather better than some other types of artifacts in the jungle conditions. We know now, and this was only learned relatively recently, that their language is hieroglyphic. Uh, we knew it was hieroglyphic, but we only recently discovered that it's not hieroglyphic like in the way Egyptian hieroglyphics are, where each um, hieroglyph stands for a word or a concept. Instead, they're phonetic, right? So each hieroglyph stands for some phoneme that combine, right, to form words. Once they figured that out, we've only recently began to be able to translate many of the texts, and of course that helps us to know a great deal more about the Maya. So before we had translated them, we had thought that the texts were astronomical information because we did know that the Maya were astronomers, good astronomers and mathematicians. But now that we can read them, it turns out that the texts record mostly historical exploits of royalty, kind of woven together with mythological elements and religious elements. But it's mainly, yeah, the record of kings and queens and wars. Popol Vuh is the primary Mayan religious text, and we'll talk much more about that in a future lecture. So the nature of a civilization is going to be determined in large part by what sorts of resources are available. And Mayans had access to limestone and sandstone, which was the primary building material. They had some granite for stone tools, lots of sea life. So much of the Mayan territory was coastal. So they had, stingray spines were used for rituals and of bones of sea creatures. They had a notable lack of herd animals or pack animals, right? There were not horses and pigs and sheep. Um, Anyone's read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, uh, he cites the presence of like herd animals as like one of the main reasons that Europeans were so sort of like prolific in their conquering of other civilizations at a certain point in history, um, because it leads to a lot of diseases. At any rate, yeah, the Mayans did not have anything quite like that. They had ducks and bees and dogs. Um, Obsidian was very important, right? It can make very sharp cutting implements. Right? Text knows sharper than surgical steel, right? So um, they did have very sharp blades. Did not have metal, right? This is stone tools that the Mayan were using. And the obsidian really only came from volcanic areas in the north, but we see it everywhere all over at Mayan sites, which indicates that there was lots of trade throughout the empire, and obsidian was one of the important things that was traded, and that this trade didn't just include the necessities, but luxury goods, right? So it seemed like there was relative prosperity throughout the empire at certain points. So the civilization collapsed around 900 CE AD, right? Um, there are theories as to why. There's no single answer. We can sort of pick out three main theories. One blames the slash and burn method of agriculture, which required constant clearing of the rainforest, using up the nutrients. Right, you didn't get as many years of crops out of the land, and they had a rapid rise in population when there was lots of land, right, to be had. But then, as you have to go farther and farther, land becomes more scarce. You couldn't keep the population up, and it's collapsed. That's one theory. Another theory blames warfare. We do know that towards the later period of the empire, there was lots of warfare among the city states. As we'll get into, as we'll describe, it was largely separate city states, and it's unclear how they understood the boundaries, you know, whether they ever sort of came together into larger territories or if they're always sort of relatively independent. But at any rate, there was a good deal of warfare among them, and this may have splintered the empire and led to the downfall as well. Um, Another version, uh, well, all of these are compatible with each other, right? So there's a third theory that says there was an external ecological disaster. There was some great drought that caused the collapse of civilization. Certainly, three things could have been going on at once, and could have both of the ecological problems could have enhanced the warfare as well. So earliest evidence of the Mayans, their pottery, which is distinctive, starts to show up around 1800 BCE in Guatemala. That time they were living mainly in sort of thatched houses of like, some things um, on dirt foundations. By about 300 BC, so 1500 years later, we start to see some more complex temples, right, built out of right, limestone, painted, stuccoed, and painted. We see indications of hierarchy, right? So um, these temples were constructed by common people under the command of elite people. In order to construct something like that, you need some sort of hierarchy. And we start to see evidence of trade in jade and obsidian, right? Precious sort of items that were being traded all over the empire, used in the ritual areas. So we see the empire starting to get going here around 300 BC. And here this we call the classic period, right? So 300 to 900 is um, sort of the peak of the Mayan civilization. So this is where we start to see these stone stelae that are inscribed with the hieroglyphs, with a clearer idea of what was going on during that time. So these stelae were typically erected in front of palaces or temples, and they would just recount events in a ruler's life, their birth to the throne, perhaps an important battle, and so on. You certainly had a royalty during this period, right? Kings, queens, bureaucrats, and when you have an aristocratic class, they're going to have to live off of the labor of common farmers. Uh, the larger cities had the palaces and the courts. You had the craftspeople were living in the larger cities, right? So you did need skilled builders and craftsmen to build tools and things like that. They would be located in the larger cities. Mayans did. It was possible for Mayan women to reach the top of the social order. So there were queens. Um, they were in the minority, but they certainly did exist. And according to the stelae, they often wielded great power, these queens. Um, so around 600, we have the peak of the Mayan civilization. The population was at its highest. The building projects were that they're most impressive. The artistic production, right, the artifacts that we find were at their most skilled. And uh, at this point, supporting the urban population was likely a strain on the farmers. We also have an increase in warfare during this period, and thus the theories, right? Were they running out of land in order to support this huge population? Was all this wealth becoming a temptation to warfare and raiding, and that was starting to splinter? Or was it some external thing that? So as I noted, we don't exactly know how they understood the territories of these city states, but there did tend to be a single large city surrounded by smaller villages that were under the control of that, the aristocracy of that city. Uh, there was a plazuela model, right? So even the big cities and the smaller villages were built around a central plaza, and there would be buildings around it. Um, Many of these, I mean, I've seen many of these ruins, Belize and Guatemala, and I recommend it if you ever get a chance. They're quite impressive. Uh, so the temples, as you can see, were built very, very tall. Inside was filled with rubble, and on the top was just a relatively small room, a little platform, and a small building, and that's where they did the ceremonies. Um, Ball courts. So there was a ball game that was very important, had sort of political and religious implications. This game, losing the game could mean your death, right? It was sort of a life and death sort of game sometimes. Um, so it was a small rubber ball made from the rubber of a tree, and you could only use sort of your upper arms. It wasn't like you couldn't use your hands or feet. So you sort of bumped it with your arms, your elbows, or your thighs, and you had to get it up through this little hoop. Um, and we'll talk more about it, and we'll see some pictures in a future lecture. But an interesting game, and it was really central to their whole political and religious life. This game, it was integrated in a way that you don't really see elsewhere. Uh, when your relatives died, you would bury them beneath your house along with some, jewelry, pottery, other things. They believed in an underworld uh, where your deceased relatives would continue to exist. So as we noted, right, slash and burn agriculture was common, but we also see evidence of terraced hillside farms and farms placed on areas drained by canals. So you would have a swampy area, drain it, and farm there. They grew corn, they grew beans, and other sort of tree crops. Again, they didn't have a lot of domesticated animals. They had dogs, they had ducks, and bees for honey. But so they had to uh, deer and wild pigs were an important source of protein, and those were hunted. Right? Some animals just can't be domesticated. It's interesting. Um, the zebra, right? You would think in Africa they have a kind of horse, right? So why would not people be riding around on zebras? Um, and domesticated zebra for whatever reason. And similar with possibly with these deer and pigs. But on the whole, skeletal remains indicate that the Maya were healthy, right? They did get enough nutrient. So everyday items were mostly produced locally, but there was trade, right? There was primarily trade in obsidian, jade, special kinds of pottery, certain marine resources, and mercury, interestingly, right? Span the empire. So there was trade. It was the cities were the central trading hubs, and goods could get from city to city. And again, at their peak, there was about 80 of these cities. So um, even in a small village, you could get obsidian from the trade routes were by sea, it would be by canoe. There's no evidence that they used sailing. Um, there were overland trails and some roads made of limestone. It was humans, right, that did the travel, right, the overland travel, often slaves. Um, Again, not a lot of pack animals, not any really. Um, they also didn't appear to have the wheel, right? They didn't have carts. They didn't use wheels for their pottery either, so they didn't had not developed the wheel. They certainly had art. It was often displayed on pottery that we have preserved or on temple walls. There are large murals and cave paintings that depict scenes of everyday life that we'll see some later in future lectures. There's evidence of large feasts, ollies, and chocolate, and evidence of that has been discovered as well. The pottery art shows us what some of these feasts look like with dancers and musicians and things like that. So, um, as we said, once we translated the hieroglyphic language on these stelae, we realized that this is largely historical information, right, about kings and queens. Um, it does include some information about trade, mathematics, astronomy, but sort of incidentally, right? If in talking about the history of someone, they had to mention some astronomical fact, it would come in that way. As far as we can tell, only the upper classes were literate. So we've in sort of the village communities where it would be people would be largely illiterate. We have found hieroglyphs, but they appear to be nonsense. So they sort of were copying what they saw on these stelae, but not quite understanding what they were, and just drawings of something that looked similar. They did have a complex mathematical system. They had the concept of zero, which is fairly sophisticated development, and they had this complex astronomical system. So this picture here is of a calendar, right? Um, they had a polytheistic religion, and the king or queen was one of the deities, right? A central one. Uh, Ritual played an important role in their lives. So whenever there was like a wedding or a funeral, there would be religious rituals. Rituals involved a great deal of bloodletting, so they would use again obsidian, very sharp, and they would cut themselves, so that the ear or the penis, um, various areas, and sometimes burn the blood, right? Save the blood on a piece of bark and burn it. Also, tobacco smoking, vision quests, sometimes um, enhanced by hallucinogenics, which were taken in the form of an enema. Uh, so lots of interesting, like religious rituals that we can more about. Okay, and finally they did right collapse. Seems like one by one the Mayan cities were abandoned. We've seen the three theories, right? Maybe it was overpopulation, maybe it was warfare, maybe it was an ecological disaster, or maybe some combination of those three, mutually reinforcing each other. Uh, we know of the falls of cities, so when a city was conquered by another city, they would right, erect a stele celebrating it. Um, it doesn't seem like they typically would conquer a city and then, you know, populate it with their own people and try to make it thrive. They were largely concerned with taking captives in warfare, um, sometimes for sacrifice, um, but it wasn't. Yeah, conquering other cities was not as so. Again, if they conquer a city and then just basically kidnap the population, then yeah, that city is inhabited. Uh, by 900, all the large cities were gone. There was still a rural Mayan population. They had begun to decline as well. Obviously, in that area, people with of Mayan descent are still there now, um, but the civilization as it stood was pretty much gone by 900. And again, we're not entirely sure why. We have some evidence from we can do DNA testing of the skeletons, the remains of Mayan people, and we don't see any evidence of like some big disease or any other obvious factor that would lead to the population decline. So still a bit up in the air, and kind of interesting to see what we'll discover in the coming years. So this is sort of an introductory lecture. The next one will be quite a bit longer, and it will cover chapters 7 and 8 of that text. We'll talk about their political organization and the Mayan religion. So I'll see you then.